Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of Life with Zach. Today we're back at the Seven Bends State Park, but instead of talking about the park today, or even Camp Lupton, we're going to go back earlier in the history of this piece of property to the mid 18th century, or the 1700s, when behind me would have existed the Dellinger Farm in this area along the Shenandoah River. Now, what happens is in 1762, Frederick Dellinger gets a land grant for 100 acres along this area. At the time, it's called wasted and unused land, but the reality was it was river bottom land. So it would have been a pretty prosperous farming area that the Dellingers received for probably a little bit of nothing. Now, he and his wife came here and settled down, eventually purchasing another 62 acres until they owned basically the entire piece of land from the mountain in the background over to the river back this way. Now, at the time, he would have been one of several people living in this area who received land grants. Thomas Lord Fairfax had received the Northern Neck grant from the Crown and was dividing up land grants in our communities, and individuals coming down from Pennsylvania or other parts of Virginia were receiving these land grants for cheap, especially compared to property in the Pennsylvania or eastern part of Virginia. So he would have gotten this grant, and there would have been probably several thousand people in Shenandoah County who would have received these grants over time for different pieces of property. But he would have been here kind of isolated on this river bend, connected into the Great Wagon Road, which is about a mile to the west of us. And like his neighbors, he would have set up farming here. That would have meant growing wheat, growing livestock for his family, growing fruit trees, growing basically anything that they could grow, either for sustenance for him and his family or for export. The biggest export, of course, at the time was different grains, either milled and sent out or distilled into whiskey or other types of alcohol, just like the fruits could have either been eaten or distilled out and then sold. But probably half of his effort would have been on sustenance crops, taking care of his family. So we're talking about keeping a garden, vegetables, meats, smoking meats, salting meats, so they would have food during the winter. Basically anything the family would have needed to live. Now the Dellingers, they stay here for really almost 200 years. What had initially been kind of this wasted land, like I said, proved to be pretty fertile. The Shenandoah River, running across limestone, flooding, depositing nutrients into the soil, would have made this a really good place to farm. And eventually accounts note that it is a really prosperous farm. As the Dellinger family grows and kind of really makes this their own space. Now over time, despite the prosperity of the farm, this would have become once again kind of an isolated area, and probably kind of one of those places people kind of felt was the backwoods, especially as the town of Woodstock grew up to our west. This area would not have had any road access. You would have had to cross the river to get here. It flooded on a regular basis, so it wouldn't have been, for a lot of people, an optimal place to live or really connected to the community as much. So in the 1930s, when Massanutten Military Academy starts looking for a place to build a summer camp, a recreation area, they start looking at farms. Apparently the Dellinger family was ready to sell. There isn't a lot of clear evidence on why, but they decided to sell, and the Academy would have looked at this property as really unused, kind of backwoods area that had little value except for what they wanted it for, which was to turn it into a summer camp. So they come in and find the Dellinger house that's here where the family had lived. And unfortunately, in 1936, they tear down the house, even though that it could be dated back to the 1700s. And the Dellinger family, knew this and had shared this with the Academy, but it doesn't appear that there was really any issue with tearing it down. Apparently, historic preservation had not taken hold in the Shenandoah Valley at the time, and despite the fact that the newspapers reported it was one of the oldest houses in the area, it doesn't appear there was really any heartbreak over the fact that it was demolished. But the Academy basically comes in and rips up all the evidence of this area being a farm. They remove the house, they remove all the outbuildings, and basically reconstruct this area as a summer camp, which we talked about in the Camp Lupton episode. But like I said, for almost 200 years before then, from the time 1760s when the Dellinger family gets that land and comes here, until 1936 when Camp Lupton opens, this was a prosperous agricultural area of the county. And today, we see some of that legacy in the fact that Seven Bend State Park, part of the land that they have here is leased out to different farmers who make hay off of it, who grow corn and other crops. There isn't any livestock over here, but it does have some of that agricultural heritage. Now, a couple other things to think about, living over here in the bend of the river in, let's say, the 1780s, when you would have been a couple miles from the nearest community, which would have been Woodstock, crossing the river. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine some simple things that the family would have had to live with. So first of all, just imagine how dark and isolated one would feel in the middle of the night. When you're over here basically without the aid of any type of electricity or really any gas, anything like that you could have lit, any light you're going to have is going to be produced by candles that you're going to make yourself, because candle making was very popular in the area. So really and if there's going to be a lamp, it's going to be maybe a whale oil lamp, but that's probably unlikely because that's going to be an expensive thing for somebody living in this area to have. So you got to imagine just how dark it would be, how bright the stars would be, how maybe isolated one might feel living over here. The second thing you got to think about is, because of that isolation, what the family would have to go into just to make sure that they were fed, clothed, and had stuff to live. So, it was basically on you and your family to produce everything that you needed, or at the very least, if there were things that you couldn't produce, to make enough stuff that you could sell to get the money for the stuff you needed. It really is, even though you're exporting crops, it really is sustenance farming, because very few families got ahead apart from the land that they were able to purchase. So, they would have grown their own food. They would have had to preserve their own food. They would have had to make their own clothing. Like I said, make their own candles. They were responsible for getting their own water, so probably a well or getting it from the river, in things that they brought forth themselves. They would have been responsible for building their own structures. So, the houses that they built, the outbuildings. We know that they had a workshop here. We know that they, probably would have had numerous outbuildings like blacksmith shops and things that they could have made their own tools. Most likely they would have had some type of primitive or just rudimentary sawmill where they could have produced their own lumber. for their own use. So they're basically building all of this stuff themselves during the 18th and 19th century. I mean, there's not the option of going to Lowe's or Home Depot to pick up some 2x4s when you need to build something. You either, notch a log yourself, or if you have the ability to have some type of sawmill, then you would make it yourself. So you got to consider that anything that they did over here, they had to rely on themselves. Also, in terms of that isolation, you have to think about communication and interaction with the outside world. Now, as isolated as the Dellinger family would have been here, they would have still had connections with the outside world. We know that because land and legal transactions would have had to take place at the courthouse in Woodstock. So they did anything with their land, all right, or any type of legal transaction, or really any type of transaction at all, they would have gone into Woodstock to make sure that that was duly recorded and to meet with people who take care of it. They were also probably gone for religious services. Now, we're not talking today like we go to church every Sunday. Most likely ministers at the time would have been here once a month, once every 6 weeks, preaching in this area. But they would have gone to do things like that. And they would have made connections with these other farm families and these other members of the community when they went. So while they are an isolated area, it's not maybe as isolated as we think they were. It's not like you only got off the farm once a year to go to the store. You might get off the farm once a month to take mail and to do other things in town, and then come back. So, those are just a few things to consider about, this early family that would have called this area home. The family of Frederick Dellinger and his descendants that lived here until formation of Camp Lupton in 1936 on this beautiful and what would have been very prosperous farm. And they would have been one of several in Shenandoah County and in the Shenandoah Valley that would have been in very similar living conditions. So hopefully you enjoyed this brief kind of history and overview of the Dellinger family, and I guess just living here in the 18th century and what that might have been like a little bit. If you did, hit like, leave a comment with any questions or anything. I'll try to follow up. And as always, if you want to catch videos as they come out, learn more about what's going on, click that subscribe button so that you get notifications anytime anything new happens on my channel. So thanks again for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope you have a wonderful day.